Okey doke. Over to
Okay.
you, Scott.
All right, so we're gonna tie this fly tonight. This is and if is anybody tying along with me? Okay, so I'll walk you through this one. This is an old Carrie Stevens pattern. It is called the White Devil, and it's got readily available materials. I guess that was that was the reason I picked this one. And if you look at this fly, it's got the inner wings on it. There are two orange wings with a white wing on the outside. And then the shoulder is a Hungarian partridge. That's what we call it over here. And it's the white and black, white and brownish feathers. And that's the shoulder on it. It's got a floss body, a black floss body with a silver rib and a silver tag on it. And it's got a white bucktail belly. And if you look at this, a lot of people don't notice this, but if you look at this, what you're gonna see is you can't see the shank of the hook very well. It's covered by the feathers, the wing feathers. And what Carrie Stevens does is when she mounts her wings, and I'll show you how she did it, she glues them all together, one side, so she'll have the two orange and the white, and they're glued together. And then the shoulder was glued on as well, because she didn't have a vise. She tied all these with her hand. And then she would put one side on, wrap it, then she would put the other side on and wrap that. And it tented over the shank of the hook. And the front of it, where my fingers are, that shoulder area, it's pretty rigid. It's because it's all cemented together. And when it swims in the water, it pushes water because of its rigidity, but the back of it, the tail on the back, will wiggle back and forth, side to side, like it was a real fish. So I don't know if she knew what she was doing with that, because she was, she was a milliner. She made those feathers in men's hats, and they're all glued together on the band of the hat. And I don't think she realized that by gluing them, she was actually enhancing the back of the fly's motion, because in the modern era after her, most of the people mounted their hooks like the last fly I showed you the last time I was here. We mounted the feathers on top of the hook, and that people refer to as the Eastern method. And that the front of the fly is not as rigid, so the action in the water is slightly different. But that's a long way of saying, giving you the reason why she did it. So whenever I start my fly, I always start the thread about 2 wooden match heads behind the eye of the hook. That gives me a lot of room to work. And then I just try to lay a pretty flat thread base down. And I'm using white thread, even though it calls for black floss as the body. I always use either primrose or white underneath, unless maybe I have red floss. If I have red floss, I would use the red thread underneath it. And I just get a good coating. And if you hold the tag off at about I'd say about a 15, 20 degree angle off of the shank of the hook, it just allows those thread wraps to kind of edge wrap next to each one. And it'll give you a nice smooth base. And get down near the bottom, just snip the waste off. And then work it down. So when I get it, where I want to get this without whacking the hook point, that's the one thing you'll find about those Sprite hooks. You even get your thread a sniff near the point and it's gone. They're really sharp. So I get it down to about where the barb starts, right there. You can see where the barb starts, and that's where I want it to hang. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and I'm going to get some Mylar, and this is size 12, medium. Snip off I usually snip off a good chunk, because what I find is if I get about a foot and a half, then I can get 2 or 3 flies tied without a problem. Oh, and I want to show you this. I showed this last time. So I want the silver side to face up. And so what I do is I take the tag end, the short end, and I point it towards the rear of the fly. And I'm looking at the gold because I want the silver to show. And I reach around my bobbin and I cradle the gold against my thread. So you can see it right there. And then what I do is I sandwich the gold together and I switch the thread into my left hand, and then I rotate it to the far side of the hook shank. And I just slide it up and then I pull on my thread. Now, when I pull on my thread, I've pinned it right in, nice and easy. And you can see because when I rotate it, the tag end that is now pointing towards the eye of the hook. And then I can just take one, because this is going to be a tag. It's going to just be before the floss starts. Take about 4 wraps back and then about 3 or 4 wraps forward, and I can let it hang. And then I have a Regal vise, so it has this an arm up on the far side, and I just drop that Mylar into the arm, and it keeps it away from me. Then I'm going to get, this is 4-strand rayon from Danville. I saw you guys were talking the other day about what's the best silk or floss, and you were using Semperfi. I've never seen that over here, so I couldn't really judge. But they make this right down the road, so it's a New Hampshire product. So it's easy for me to get. And I take 2 strands, and I do the same thing with the cradling, rotate it, slide it up, take the working end and put it off to the side. And then I just slowly start to wrap up. And what I try to do is really get my thread flattened, because that way when everything starts to be wound up to make the body, everything will be, there won't be a big bump there. Most of the salmon tires, the old guard, they would, if they were using floss, they would apply it similar to what I just did. If their body was all silver tinsel or gold tinsel, they would start the tinsel at the head, work it down, work it back, edge wrap it down, and then overlap just a smidge on the way back. And that what it would do is it would give them a really strong body that wouldn't get ripped up. And they would often put they would varnish and they would go down to the bend. Then they would varnish again and they would go back up to the head. And then they would tie it all off and they would varnish it again. And they would be using varnish that was cut with a thinner, just a little bit, because then it would dry a little bit faster. And I just kind of wrap it up. I usually wet the floss just a little bit, the waste end, and I keep the floss on the bottom, and I keep the Mylar on the far side. So the side you're seeing is the side that I try to keep the Mylar. Sometimes it's starting to go under by thread tension, but and as you get up towards the front of the hook, what's happening is you're really taking all those fibers from the floss and making them kind of really be under a lot of tension. And so they want to kind of separate a little bit. So what I do right about now is I just flatten my thread. And as I come around, each time I come around, right about here is where I put my tension. I'm really just laying the thread on the rest of the time. You get used to doing it that way. And that way, what happens is you're putting the tension on the material kind of after you've gone by it. So it's still going to be tucked in there, but it's not going to spread out and start to try to fray and then be all messed up in when you're near the end of your fly. All right, so I'm back up to where I started, and that's where I want to be. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my black floss and I'm going to bring it straight up above the shank and just gently stroke it to flatten it out. And my first wrap, I want to make my first wrap go completely around the shank of the hook once. I don't want to put any angle on it to try to advance it. The second wrap, I'll start to advance it. What'll happen is if you try to advance it too quickly, or you try to advance it at a greater angle than maybe 15 degrees, what'll happen is it'll separate those two pieces of floss. And then what you'll end up doing is it'll split and it won't cover evenly. And then it'll start to try to fray. And then once you start getting past the hook point, as you come up, if you wiggle the floss just a little bit, then what it does, and I'm not putting a lot of tension on this, it's just like moderate tension. What it does is those fibers kind of work in between each other. And instead of having any lines in there or bumps, it looks really, it gets as smooth as you can get it. You know how the classic salmon fly tires, they burnish their silk. This is kind of a halfway method of trying to burnish your silk. And I'm sure that Carrie Stevens, she probably started with some type of silk and then moved to the floss only because it became readily available. And as you get going, you can really get this stuff going and get it on. You just got to be careful. If you let go of it, get the razor blade out. All right. And then I wrap it off. Anything that's sticking up, just pull it. And you'll be fine. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually trim the floss. and I'm gonna whip finish. Just 2 turns. That way, when I put the Mylar on, if it bounces a little bit, it's not gonna undo the floss. Okay, so here I come around, I'm gonna put a tag on. The tag's just 2 or 3 wraps right before the floss. And then with these hooks, traditionally they had like 9, 8, 9, 10 wraps, ribs. So what I do is I get the first wrap on and then I eyeball the middle of the floss. And that's where I want to be 4 or 5, the 4th or 5th wrap. There's 2, 3, 4, we're almost to the middle. 5, the space between the wraps is in the middle. 6, 7, 8, and I'm into the 9th one, and then I just reach up and again tie it off and snip it off. And then I do another whip finish. Because if that comes undone, like I said before, I get the razor blade out. All right, so we're in good shape. All right, so the next thing is the belly. And that is going to be white bucktail. So we get these big, these are huge. This was one that was shot somewhere here in New Hampshire. And they have really, these big ones have really, really long hairs on them. And they're not too thick. And I take the material from right in here on both sides. Up here, they're very thin, but the tips can break. Down below, as they get closer to the animal's body, they tend to start to get thick, a little bit thicker. So I get, there's probably 25 hairs here, okay? And I usually try to stack them a couple times just to make sure I'm getting everything lined up. And I use a big hair stacker, wide mouth. All right. And then all I do is I try to cull out any of the small ones both ways. And then, because when this bucktail gets wet, when it gets wet in the water, it doubles, it looks like it's doubled in size. I don't want a lot of bucktail on this. I just want enough, like, you know, a bait fish would have a little white belly. You guys have brown trout over there, right?
Yeah.
You know how most of the trout is the spots and the color, and then there's that thin little white. Well, this is what similar. You don't want so much bucktail that it makes it not look realistic. So then I like to have my belly extend about a gap's length beyond the bend of the hook. So what I do is I measure it by rotating my vise upside down, and then I take my fingers and I pinch it right like this, and then I reach in and I snip it. And then what I do right here is I relax my fingers. See if I can show it to you. I relax my fingers and see how I get a little bit of tie-in area. And then I just lay it on and I take 3 wraps, light, just to hold it in place. And I take a look, make sure it's about the right length, because I can always undo it. Then I pinch it back, and now I wrap forward and put some tension on. And there we go. There's your belly, okay? And then what I want to do is I take some varnish, and it's thin, just a little bit, and I just touch the tie-in spot with the varnish. And that's going to help lock that in. Now, let me look at my recipe. White bucktail. Throat. The throat is blue bucktail, blue Schlappiner hen. And I'm not going to put that on yet because the underwing is got peacock curl. And so I take the tail, and I'm looking for pearls that have the point not damaged. I want to have that tapered point. And she would put on between 4 and 6. So I'm going to put on 6. And peacock, if they were the king of the hill, every one of their feathers are going to be perfect. But if they were, a wise ass little kid in the playground that wasn't playing good with the other birds, they're going to be all beat up. Their feathers will be beat up. And so you might not get as many of the tips that aren't damaged. So I try to line them up, which is next to impossible. No matter what you do, you're going to have some that are a slight bit longer than the other. But rest assured, the first thing that's going to go after you catch a fish are these. These are the most brittle, and they will be the first thing that goes. So if they stay, it's the way I tell my classes, I say it's survival of the fittest. The fittest ones will stay. The rest of the ones don't need to be there. They will not make it. Okay, so I got 6 on, and I'm going to trim them. Trim the waist. And then I'm just going to wrap forward a little bit, because what I want is to have a pretty good base here. I'm going to add some winging material and a few other things to this. So I don't want to have it, the thread have a drop off, because then when you tie, the more material you tie on, everything is going to fall forward. The other thing about this is that the method that I'm using to tie on material going forward is like shingling your house. Each piece of material is going to be in front of the last one. So I'm going to put on, let's see, let's get some orange hen. And I'm just going to take some orange hen, get the tips relatively straight, and tie a little bit of the orange hen on in front of where the peacock curl went. Then I'm going to alternate. I'm going to take a little bit of the blue hen and tie that on underneath. This is the beginning of the throat. And then I'll put a little bit more blue on. And each time I'm moving a little bit more towards the eye of the hook. And then I'll finish up on the top with orange. All right, now, the reason for that is that when we build the wings need something to kind of keep them from rolling to each side. And so these, the throat and the upper throat, which you won't see. The upper throat will be completely hidden. What that does is it will help it, because you're basically putting one wing on about 10 o'clock on one side and one wing on the other side at about 2 o'clock. So the stems are up against the sides of the hook in the Carrie Stevens method. If you were tying her, you would just place them on top. You wouldn't need that that little tuft of orange on the top, because they're going to sit right on top. They're not going to roll around. But with her method, you have to have something to help that. All right. So, and that's the whole shingling piece. Now, it's got a black head. So I got to switch thread. And this is always a when you're first learning, almost all the time, you snip off the black thread as you're doing this, just because you're thinking about the next step. The beginners are always ahead of themselves. I don't know why, but they want to end it. They want it to be done. And then you can do one of two things. You can go and trim it up a little bit. Or you could wait to trim it up. But if you trim it up, then you can get a nice base. To get your wings in place. Okay, now wings. So we have 2 white. So we have the white here, and I'm gonna see if I can find a good one. So I'm gonna take one from one side over here, and then one from about the same spot on the other, because technically they should be about the same. And then I'm going to take the orange, and I'm going to take 2 from each side. Okay. 1, 2. Okay, perfect. Now, if you look at these feathers, they have they've got like a broad, wider area here, and they taper nicely, and they're fairly stiff. They're not, they got the flexibility, but they're not like drooping down like this. That's a good streamer feather. And if you look very closely at it, you're also going to see that the stems are not huge. If this, like the grizzly ones, the grizzly stems are usually thicker than the stems from the white ones that are dyed. So then all I do is I measure to the back of where the material is, the peacock curl, and I reach in and I make just a little line separating the barbs. And then I'm gonna cull the barbs off. And you could do these both at the same time if you wanted to, but the rate of waste, because you made a mistake, is huge. So, you know, like you guys are all very intelligent, I can tell. And you know that you cannot put feathers back on the stem after you take them off. All right. So you want to err on the fact that if you take too much off, your goose is cooked. And so that first feather that I strip, that's my kind of my template for the rest. And then I just and I've always I had a class in streamer tying, and I showed them how to do this. And about a year later, one of the guys who was in the class came to another class, and I said, "Oh, you're back." And he goes, "Oh yeah, I'm all screwed up." And I said, "Well, what's the matter?" And he said, "Well, you know, I know the whole thing about, you know, stripping the feathers so they're all the same length." He goes, "But it seems like when I get my feathers all built and ready to put on the wing, they're not all the same length." So I said, "Oh, I can tell you what you're doing wrong." He said, "Well, what's that? How do you know? You haven't even seen me tie." I said, "You take the first feather and you use that to measure the second one. And then you take the second feather and use that to measure the third one.
Mm.
And you keep going down the line like that. And believe it or not, each one
Different.
is slightly longer than the last one." And he couldn't believe it. He sent me a note shortly after and said, "You're absolutely right. That's what I was doing wrong." It's just human nature. It's somehow your eyeball looks at it and makes it a little longer each time. But this is really what is important to make the streamer effective in the water, is to get this all pretty much the same length. And then the last white one. And then I'll show you how she would glue the wings. And she would use probably thick varnish. She would have some varnish that had been sitting out with the cap off for a while, and it was a little thicker, and that allowed it not to bleed into the barbs. It would just keep it on the stem. You guys were the ones that told me you had Mike Martinique over once, right? To one of your club meetings? No, okay.
Sorry,
Somebody
say
else.
again?
Did you guys have Mike Martinique over there one time, years and years ago? No,
No.
somebody told me. He was another one that used to have, he would take and use, he would have several bottles of varnish, all different kind of consistencies. So what I use is this tear mender right here. And it's a latex based, they use it to fix, repair things like, I would say, clothing. If Derek made his military pants messed up from the iron, they would help him with that. It would fix it. So we put a little bit of that tear mender on it. Can you see that?
No, it's just out of focus. That's it.
Do we call that copy decks over here?
Copy decks, yeah.
Yeah, copy decks.
Use it for carpets.
There you go. It's latex based.
Yeah,
Copy decks.
And then I put the second feather right on top of it. And I just touch it. And this stuff really gets setting up quick. I'm talking too much. I gotta put a little bit more on. And then I put the white. And I make sure that the wing is all lined up. And then I just lay it on my bench while I get the other one ready. I do the same thing.
All right.
There's another, I used to use something called fabric fusion. I'll show you that in a minute. I'm going to use that for another part. And it works good too, but it doesn't seem to keep them, the feathers together very well. Okay. All right, so now that's the second wing. Right there. Now, while that's setting up, I go and get my partridge and I find two feathers here that are going to be the shoulder. Okay, got two. Get them out of the way. And then one of the things that's important is that you don't over shoulder. And after you've built a couple of these and you've gotten really good at these streamers, you're going to just be able to look at the size of the shoulder and say, yeah, look at that. That's going to be perfect size. What you don't want to do is over shoulder it. If you do, it overpowers it. And if you are, for some reason, decide you're going to cast it, it's like a helicopter in the air. It just doesn't, your leader will look like a spring, that coil that was pulled and twisted 100 times. And of course, you'll have the biggest fish of your life snap your leader.
Could you use the throats as a guide?
Could I use the what?
The throats as a guide?
Yeah. Yes,
For
you could. Yep. Yep.
Because that, to me, the throats you've put on look like a little frame to frame the
Yep.
actual beacon.
Yep. Yep. And a lot of times on a lot of her flies, between the bucktail and before you put on the throat, she would put on a golden pheasant crest.
Like a
And
salmon.
a lot of times it would be something like this shape right there. So
Yeah.
that would be the same length as your throats too.
So it'd be like just like you should use on the traditional salmon flies. It's like a frame.
Yep, exactly. Now, I tried this 2 days ago. We can always change this, but Carrie Stevens would put her shoulder on that wing, just like that. 90% of her shoulders were silver pheasant crest shoulders. And they have a little bit thicker stem than the partridge.
Silver pheasants or the Amherst, yeah?
Yeah, so they look like this. Hold on. So most of her flies would have had one of these.
Yeah.
That would have been her shoulder.
Amherst.
Okay.
That's a
Yeah.
Amherst.
Yep. And this one doesn't. So let's see. So those are more rounded and curved, and they really, when you put the a golden pheasant underneath it, it looks like it's all one piece. It really looks nice. Okay, so now I'm going to take my wing and I'm going to put the far side wing in place first. And all I want to do is get the stems lined up with the shank of the hook. Think of the shank as a rod and the 4 stems here as a rod. And I tip it up so I can see it. And all I'm going to do is wind 2 wraps. There's barely any tension on those. And then I'm going to take the other wing and I'm going to just put a touch of that adhesive on the inside stem. Then I'm going to bring that wing around, line up the tips, and lay it in place. Same thing, 2 easy wraps. Now I can look, see how that's tented right over and you can see if you, I don't know if you can see it. Let me see if I can twist it. Can you see the little bit of the orange right there in between?
Yep.
So that was that upper tuft that I put in, and that's keeping that lined up really well. Now, once I got it in place, I can squeeze it, and then I'm going to wrap forward once, and as I come around, I'm going to put a little tension pulling up, another wrap, a little tension pulling up, and a third one, a little tension pulling up. And now I've got the wings right in place. Whoops. I had the wings in place. And I can crank it up just a little bit more. All right, now let's just get this together. Okay. It's a lot of material here. As you're building that last bit, you can make all the minor adjustments you need. All right. Then the last thing is the jungle cock. So what I do here is, this is where I use the fabric fusion. It's clear. I just put a little bit on the back side of the jungle cock and lay it in place in a couple wraps. And then I do the same thing for the other side.
Nice shape to that.
Yeah.
And then I crank it down. Now, the last part of this wing is not behaving. Now it is. Okay. The last part of this is the trimming. So what I try to do is trim the material in the opposite order that I put it on. And if you bend the material, if you bend the stem against the thread, it gives you a little bit of a nice spot to cut it. Okay, now finish it up and work the head. So with these streamers, we start at the head, up by the eye, and we work our way back. Try to cover all the holidays there from the jungle cock. There it is. All right, and then Carrie Stevens would have taken her she did this by hand. She would take it off and she would cut her thread. And then I'll do what she did. Her signature was a red band in the middle of the head.
And is that floss or light bright?
Nope, this is just regular old Danville 70
All right.
70 denier thread. Nothing special. Couple wraps and then whip finish. Give it a snip. And then what I do is I hit it pretty hard with the thin, watered down varnish and let it just suck right in. There's a little bit of a tag on the end there, but we can snip that off once it hardens.
Yeah, just push it down with the scissors.
Yeah, you can. I don't have it right in front of me. One of the things that I usually use is the scalpel to cut that red off. I never, very rarely do I ever put the red on. That was her thing, that was her specialty. So it's kind of historically, I leave it that way. So there you go. That's your basic Carrie Stevens style streamer. That you saw how that front, nice and rigid. That is going to make that fly perform really well in the water, and it's pretty durable. You could cast this, whatever you want, or just troll it. And so basically what I do is then after that sets a little bit, I'm going to take the non-cut varnish
Yeah.
and just start laying it on. And I usually let the first one sink in.
Right.
And then I put one coat on like that, and then I'll take it off and put the fly behind me and let it, and I'll go on to the next fly or something like that. And then maybe an hour or so later, that varnish is pretty hard, and then you can put a little bit more on and
Make it like
use, you build it up, and it looks nice that way. If you
This-
put too much on and you blob it, then it gravity will let it pull down, and you'll have this like little bubble underneath the head, and it doesn't affect the fly, doesn't do anything. It's just for your eye, it wouldn't look good.
It just makes the fly look good, and the head is the focal point of the fly.
Right.
You're talking about the old traditional salmon head finishing, because what they used to do, because there was so much material in the head, they used to leave parts of the material showing. Then they take the first coat of varnish, which was half thin as half varnish, leave it seep through. Then they put a black varnish on, and on top of that, they put a clear varnish on, so it'd make it absolutely perfect. And it
Right.
sets the materials as well, like you just said.
Right. And that's a really good point, because one of the things that can happen with some of these materials is the stems are so thin, and so brittle, that when you use the fly, the shoulders in particular can come off. And one of the things that I like to do is, let's just say, here's a silver pheasant right there. You can see that. And if I just stuck it on with that stem is slippery. But if I alter just a little bit and trim right at the base and leave that little bit of fiber, can you see that?
Yeah.
Just a little. It's like, having a crew cut type, little bit of hair just on the side. And then when your thread is wrapping, it bites into that, and it holds it. It makes it stronger. That's the whole thing. The strength of the fly, you want it to last. You don't want it to fall apart. And Carrie Stevens did a lot of flies with the body of floss. That floss goes really quickly because the salmon's teeth and the brook trout, the big ones, will just chew it up. And if you look at the evolution of these flies, tyers always went with the floss at the beginning. And then if they were tying for people who were buying them, the people would come back and say, gee, my fly only lasted, 3 fish. And then they stopped. And they would take, instead of orange floss, they would use copper. There's old red embossed tinsel. They would use that instead of the red floss. And they would rib it with the mylar on top of it. So you can't really tell. It's so subtle. And so people started to say, hey, we're going to do this to make them last, not just fall apart. So
yeah.
So that's it. You guys, any other questions?
No, very good.
Good.
Very good. I did want to tie along with you tonight, but I got stuck in work and I came late. I even
Work
bought
is a
the
bad thing.
I
We
even bought
can
the
do it again, Derek. Oh, you got them. Which ones are those? They come in a green?
Yeah, the partridge and the streamer 7X.
Show
And
me it.
these are the size 2.
Isn't it? Wow, they changed their, because they must have changed their
They
They're
have, yeah.
packaging, 'cause they were black for a while.
And they're orange as well.
Those, the orange ones are the salmon ones, right?
The Attitude ones, the Predator ones.
Yeah,
But they
okay,
still got, they've also still got the black.
yeah, the black, those caddis emergers, the good ones.
Oh, yeah, lovely.
Yeah, they're good. Yeah, so, we can do it again sometime, Derek. You know how to get a hold of me, right?
Yeah,
So, well, thank you.
thanks for doing it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. You guys all don't get in trouble. I don't want to hear like on Monday morning that a bunch of guys were in trouble at the BFFI, okay? I don't want to hear about that. I'm gonna have Timmy keep an eye on you guys.
Yeah.
I ain't keeping an eye on yourself.
Yeah.
Well, Serena's gonna be with him, I'm sure. All right, guys.
During getting trouble in
Thank you.
an empty room.
Thanks ever so much, Scott.
Thank you, Scott.
Cheers,
Bye-bye.
Scott.
Yeah.
That's
All
right.
right. Good night. Yep.
Good night.
Well,
Cheers,
Bye.
guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh.
seeing some of you lots on Saturday yet?
Yeah. There's 7 of us coming up.
7?
Yeah.
Them boys on tour, eh?
Yeah, I think Dr. Dave's going to be up there as well.
Yeah.
One of the lads is making his own way up. But there's 6 of us coming in the van.
Yeah.
So I should imagine there'll be a few others there as well.
Turn the recording off now, Derek.
Oh,
Not sure we'll be there. I'll be in the speak for you.